Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us the early morning session for South-South Cooperation on Climate, Peace and Security. Thank you also for those joining online. We'll be starting in approximately 5 minutes because we're still waiting for a few speakers and a few other people in the audience to turn up. So thank you very much for your patience. Okay, I think we can make a start. Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining this. You don't hear us? Can anyone hear me? No one can hear me? Yeah? Oh, okay, just individual. Yes, thank you very much for joining the early morning session. And also, I know there's a few competing climate security sessions today, this being obviously the thematic peace day. I hope everyone can now hear me in the room. Yep. So I'd like to welcome also, of course, our esteemed panelists for this important event on South-South cooperation on climate, peace and security, driving the localization agenda through scientific evidence. We have a consciously diverse set of panels today, in which we not only have a quite good and widespread geographic representation, but also good sectoral representation. So we have policymakers and government, we have practitioners, we have the UN present, and we also have the research community, in order to hopefully share some of the experiences each of these entities has had in terms of working with and coordinating with and actually learning from each other in relation to climate, peace and security. The way this event will work is that we will first have some opening remarks provided by Telvin Denye, who is a research fellow at the Africa Group of Negotiators Expert Support, or AGNES, after which we'll have two panel discussions with the speakers rotating on and off the stage, followed by a very quick lightning round of reflections, and of course also some time at the end for audience Q&A. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Telvin to the stage, who I think is very well positioned to provide some brief opening remarks on South-South cooperation and Agnes's role specifically in facilitating this. So any side is fine.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Telvin Muta Denje. I'm a research fellow at the African Group of Negotiators Expert Support, where I coordinate our work with climate science, how it intersects with policy and practice. So I am very privileged to be here to set the scene for what will be an interesting discussion. I think we have very fantastic panelists here, and I'm eager to find out what they have to say. But just to set the scene for them, I would like to touch on three things which I hope will come up during the discussions. The first being around the realities of the global south. I think we always need to remind ourselves of the realities that are there. So I will give the perspective of Africa because I live and work there. Most countries are either surpassing the 1.5 warming or are close to, meaning there is an accelerated impact and vulnerability, compounding vulnerability. This then opens up different pathways for climate security. I'll give you an example. Particularly for the shared resources. An example of this is Sahel, the Sahel region, which is in the Western Africa, and then the Horn of Africa, which is in the Eastern Africa. These regions have shared ecosystems, grazing lands, trading routes, and all that. So when climate impacts compound, we then get different pathways opening up that lead to climate insecurity. So those realities always have to be at the back of our mind when we're discussing these issues. And then the second bit, which I would like to see being discussed during this discussion, is what is the response that we are doing in response to it. So this usually is to policy and action, right? And unfortunately or fortunately, Africa and many of the global south countries is very heavy on policies, meaning we have very, very good policies. The unfortunate bit is there is an implementation gap. That's the first unfortunate part. We have a massive implementation gap in that we cannot translate our policies for one reason or the other, which I think is being discussed in the finance and all that. But then for what is relevant for us here is some of these policies, your NDCs, your national adaptation plans, your action plans are inward looking, meaning they are only concentrating on the borders of the country. At the subnational level are concentrating on those borders of the countries. But then not factoring in the transboundary nature and cascading nature of these climate risks. Then they also not account for very few countries have looked at have a mention of climate security in their NDCs or their NAPs. About 10 countries in Africa have a mention of transboundary climate risks in their NDCs. So already this is a gap which I think many of these partners, and hopefully the partners that will come in, can discuss how do we mainstream these ideas we have, very good ideas we have, into policy. But then, which is now brings me to the third bit, how do we then translate and close the loop on having these policies actually translating into action, which I think is now what we are here to discuss, the South-South collaboration, coordination. And I think that's where also Agnes, where I work, we are also focused mainly on a number of work streams that we work in. Maybe just to give a few examples, and I am glad the climate security team is here. We've worked on them on a number of these aspects. But essentially what we try to do is try to get the best available science and evidence, and I am glad that it's going to be discussed here as well, to influence policy. Yes? So a good example is beginning of this year, throughout actually this year, we're working with the climate security team in Kenya and Uganda, where we were trying to inform a resource sharing agreement between Kenya and Uganda. And the reason why they even had an agreement, had to sign an agreement, is because there was conflict due to resources. So for us and for partners that are here, we need to have the best available science, package it in a way that can be consumed by these policymakers, but also, on the other side, we need to also translate these policies into action. So I think with those very few remarks, I would like to welcome you to this event, and I'm really looking forward to the discussions that are going to ensue after this. And yeah, I think I hand over back to you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Telvin. Yeah, and thank you also for highlighting the role that the CGIAR has played in working together with Agnes in some of these key issues. Absolutely. I realize, as you said, the climate security team, I actually didn't introduce myself, which is not the end of the world because the panelists are more important. But my name is Frans Schappendonk. I'm a climate peace and security specialist with the Focus Climate Security team with the Alliance of Biodiversity and CIAT and CGIAR. So then, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first panel for today. So if I could welcome and invite to the stage Sarah Rabia, climate peace and security specialist with the Alliance of Biodiversity and CIAT, my colleague. We also have Philippa Hamakasu, Senior Green Economy Officer at the Zambia Ministry of Green Economy and Environment. Welcome. And last but not least, we have Michael Baum, Director of ICADA's Biodiversity and Crop Improvement Programme and Acting Deputy Director for Research. So, as I said before, we will have 2 rounds of questions for each panel, and because we have 2 panels to get through and we also want to have some time for Q&A, I'm going to ask to keep your answers fairly brief if possible, around 5 minutes. So I'm going to start, if it's okay, with Sarah. What are some of the remaining challenges and gaps across the MENA region in terms of knowledge and awareness, capacities and technologies to ensure more holistic responses to climate peace and security risks?
Thank you so much, Frans, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to, first of all, welcome you all to the session, and second of all, introduce myself very briefly. As my colleague Frans mentioned, my name is Sarah Rabia. I'm a climate peace and security specialist for the MENA Hub, the CGIAR MENA Hub, supporting my colleague here, Frans, and a bunch of other excellent people at the Hub. And prior to my time with CGIAR, prior to joining CGIAR, I was part of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Egypt, also working on the climate peace and security file for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the COP27 presidency in Sharm el-Sheikh. So going back to the question on what is left when it comes to the challenges and the gaps when in the MENA region, or focusing on the MENA region, perhaps I could start by the issue of capacities. And capacities here is, I think we have 2 separate conversations in the MENA region. The conversation on peace building and conflict resolution, which is holistically, or which is entirely focused on a political angle, on a very classic angle of analysis when it comes to political conflict resolution, peacekeeping and peace building, and also the issue of climate action, which happens to be very separated from the issue of conflict resolution in the region. there has been some advancements and there has been some active partners and stakeholders who have tried to bring these conversations together. But I think looking at other experiences, and since the session is focusing on South-South cooperation, so if we can look at it from a comparative lens, perhaps we could learn from, for example, the African experience or the experiences of different regions where this conversation has been maybe brought together more holistically. We need to look at the capacities, or we need to look at the conversations that are happening in the MENA region, and perhaps build the capacities of those working on peace building and conflict resolution efforts in the MENA region, especially now looking at the state of affairs in the region, and those working on climate action, and see some segues and see how we could bring these two conversations together. These are two different islands, two different conversations that are happening parallel to each other. What brings them together would be, like I said, capacity building, enriching the knowledge, enriching the awareness of both of these communities on why these conversations need to be merged together, and also perhaps the UN and active stakeholders in the region, research organizations in the region may have made that effort, but we need to have a home within the national capacities for this conversation as well. So building the national capacities of the MENA region on adopting the climate, peace and security agenda, on bringing these two conversations together is crucial. Also, I think this kind of intersects with the issue of awareness, and we will come back to that, and the issue of knowledge. Perhaps taking, like I said, this conversation on the knowledge scope out of the UN space, out of the organization space, and bringing the knowledge to the national actors is what we need to focus on. And there's a lot for us to learn when it comes to South-South cooperation and South-South examples and knowledge sharing. There's a lot for us to learn. CGIAR has done a lot of work on that when it comes to different regions of the world, like for example, Africa, West Africa, and the East Africa, and the Southern Hub as well. And perhaps I could use this opportunity to announce that we are using this perhaps side event to launch one of our latest knowledge products on leveraging climate smart agriculture for peace, which are insights from a bundle of interventions in Ghana. And this specifically focuses on climate smart agriculture, looking at the MENA region, which is, if not the driest, then amongst the driest regions in the world, and one of the regions that are facing acute food and water insecurity, which has, of course, its intersections and has, of course, its implications on peace and security and sustaining peace and stability in the region. Then perhaps this conversation is important for us as the MENA region to look at and to learn from. Drought, food insecurity, water insecurity is on the top of the agenda of even the Arab negotiators here at COP, of the Arab negotiators during the past two COPs. Lots of initiatives have been launched on that space. But still, there's a lot of work for us to do and a lot of advancements for us to do in that space. And I think I kept it at 5 minutes, right? I'm well beyond on the dot. Thanks so much.
Thank you for being succinct. Yeah, and thank you for highlighting, I think, the continued siloed nature with which these discussions are happening in the region. I think we often find that given the unfortunate amount of ongoing conflicts in the MENA region, that sometimes when you talk to stakeholders, bringing climate change into this conversation is challenging because it's not an immediate priority, but there's definitely need to tie these two things together. And also just to flag that the QR code for the publication you're referencing will be on the very last slide in the Q&A, so you have to stay until the end to get the publication, so please stay. If I can then move to Philippa, if that's okay. So Zambia recently published its National Green Growth Strategy for the period of 2024 to 2030, for which the Alliance of Biodiversity in CGIAR was able to support on a few key points. So firstly, congratulations for this. Could you share two key insights from the GGS that can help understand the importance of including a climate, peace and security lens into policies and operational frameworks for sustainable growth and climate action? And maybe referring back to Telvin's opening remarks, how is the Ministry of Green Economy and the Environment working towards the implementation of this component of the strategy? Thank you.
Thank you, Franz. And I don't know if I'm pronouncing your name well. So yes, we did launch our Green Growth Strategy earlier this year in April 2024, and I should mention that it's actually a very important document for us as Zambia, as it serves as our blueprint for our transition into a green economy. And the main objective or vision of the Green Growth Strategy is to achieve a low carbon, resilient and socially inclusive economy by 2030. So if you go through the Green Growth Strategy, I think the two main insights you're going to pick first is how maybe the linkages maybe also on climate peace and security phase. I'll just highlight that the green growth strategy fosters social stability, reduces environmental stress, and supports sustainable development. And I think the first key insight you would pick from that is that we highlight a lot on social stability and climate impact, as the green growth strategy tried to really emphasize the effects of climate change on human security, livelihoods, and social stability. So particularly in vulnerable sectors such as the agricultural sector. Right now we are experiencing the worst drought we have experienced in Zambia in 4 decades, and this has induced agricultural instability in both rural and urban Zambia, and this has led to food insecurity as well as economic distress, which has fueled some conflicts at different levels. I mean, generally we're a peaceful country, but with all these economic distress and the food insecurity, there are conflicts over land, water, So also I think if you go through the strategy, you'll see that we really do emphasize on risk mitigation and resilience. So the strategy did recognize that climate-compatible economic transformation is essential for mitigating risks that stem from socio-ecological and economic disruptions, and by embedding resilience building measures across sectors, actually enhanced resource efficiency, which is one of our main pillars in the green growth strategy. We seek to safeguard the peace and security from the destabilizing effects of climate-driven events. So maybe in alignment with a strategic direction, the Ministry of Green Economy and Environment is advancing its implementation efforts through capacity building, human and institutional capacity building, on institutional capacities for climate peace and security. We recently had a training with CGIAR and the code on building resilience and greening the economy for the inclusion of climate peace and security in Zambia for Zambia's climate action. And we targeted officers in the provinces and all the relevant or aligned institutions and ministries when it comes to climate peace and security, like the Disaster Risk Management Unit, our Zambia Environmental Management Unit, Ministry of Agriculture, and other institutions. And really the main objective of the training was to ensure that green growth initiatives align with the local needs and capacities, at different levels. So the training was a training for trainers, and next year we hope we can go in the provinces, so that now we go to the wards and the districts, and we are able to build capacities at all those at all those levels. So when you talk of how are we implementing the component maybe of climate peace and security, is through enhanced institutional capacity building initiatives and mainstreaming climate resilience within our policy and operational frameworks, like we have done so far in our green growth strategy. Thank you.
Thank you, Philippa. There's some very good examples. I mean, firstly, I think recognizing that climate change and conflict, or climate action and peace, are kind of situated in this complex web of cause and effect. So the agri-food sector is pretty central to this. And thank you also for highlighting some of the practical ways that researchers can actually influence the policy process and implementation through capacity building, particularly at subnational levels. So if we can turn to Michael now, if that's okay. So how do you see the role of South-South cooperation in strengthening agricultural resilience and stability in fragile countries like Sudan and Syria? And do you have any tangible examples where collaboration has actually made a difference from a CAL's perspective?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for the question. I'm coming from ICADA, a center located actually in the Middle East. And so we had... we have offices in 15 countries. 8 countries are conflict or post-conflict countries. So we like Libya, like Syria, like Sudan, Yemen, Iraq, Afghanistan. So now we might not have really the solution because we had in a number of those countries really thriving programs and projects, and still the country went into conflict and. And but wherever we can, I mean, we go the full with the country. We accompany the countries in the before the conflict, during the conflict, and after the conflict. And you mentioned Sudan and Syria. Sudan, for instance, we used to use Sudan as a country, the site for our heat platform, because it's not so much the drought in Sudan, but it's really the heat stress that affecting agricultural production. Because along the Nile River, you have the agriculture is basically all irrigated agriculture, and so that's why if you have water, you can produce crops and livestock and so on. But it's really the heat stress. Temperatures in Sudan in December, they barely just go below 30 degrees. And then, during the growing period, you have 45, 50 degrees. So that is really the challenge. And but for us, for plant breeders, I mean, an excellent opportunity to test new material in order to develop heat-tolerant varieties. Most countries in MENA or CWANA, as we call it, Central West Asia, North Africa, are wheat-based systems. Wheat is the main staple crop. We try to introduce wheat legume rotations, and but as I said, so we really need the heat tolerance in order to protect the crops against the stress. Now there are a number of ways. In this region, as I mentioned, so there are a number of conflict potentials. I mean, countries. So if you take Ethiopia, Eritrea, so there there is the conflict. It's Sudan, Darfur region, but also now the whole country under stress. Syria, we had our headquarters in Syria till 2012. Then we had to relocate. We developed a decentralization strategy. Now we have several major hubs in Morocco, in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Lebanon, as one of the strategy to adapt to the situation, because there is no guarantee that that conflict doesn't develop in another country that we are now in. It was mentioned, so in some of the countries, I think especially the Eastern Mediterranean, the average temperature has already surpassed 2 degrees, and we expect 4 degrees till the end of the century. So there are massive, conflicts. For instance, the Syrian conflict, there was often a correlation made with the climate and influx, internally displaced people from Iraq and other countries, fighting for resources, sinking water tables and really building stress. So we still operate in a number of these countries. For instance, now we are in Syria trying really to rebuild some of the economies. For a few years after 2012, 13, 14, 15, we abstained. But then since 2016, we go back again. So we work under the UN umbrella, FAO umbrella, to rebuild agriculture in the country. Now there are a number of opportunities there, NGOs that are interested to rebuild, and so now quite a bit of effort is going there. We have always used to some extent South-South cooperation in order to do a knowledge sharing between countries. For instance, IFAD had a number of programs to enable cooperation between the countries. We had a project that brought together three countries: Moldova, Morocco, and Sudan, and allowed experts, agriculture experts from the countries to travel the regions to see good examples of work on value chains and how country address problems with climate and adaptation to climate. And and I'm sure there there are other donor organizations that provide funding to enable this South-South cooperation. We have operations, farm operations in Morocco, in Lebanon, and in India, and we always have used the India hub. I mean, also really to bring modern and new technologies to the Sivana countries. Scale-appropriate mechanization is an important topic because expensive machinery from Europe or from is not appropriate. But small-scale machinery for agronomy, for coming from China, from India. So that is technology that we always have used in our countries in order to learn from other countries and bring it to the benefit of the countries in the south. So that has always been a useful element. And it's really to strengthen the agricultural sector in those countries. In Sudan, we were really on a very good way till the conflict broke out. Sudan was on a path to achieve self-sufficiency in wheat production by 2022. So these were the predictions, because increased agricultural land, we strengthened the seed sector, and this was really on a good way. And then, but then when the conflict broke out, and all this stopped. Ethiopia has actually achieved that this year. I mean, Ethiopia was also a country deficient in wheat production, but this year, for the first year, achieved self-sufficiency in wheat production. It started to export also wheat, and also here it was really the heat-tolerant and drought-tolerant material that that could be grown in the lowlands with irrigation that really helped to achieve the self-sufficiency. And so these are some of I'm a plant breeder. I come from that side, so that's promoting heat and drought tolerant materials that has helped in a number of countries really to increase agricultural production and stabilize the sector in the countries. Now, with the conflict in Sudan, we are still operating in Sudan, and in the northern part of Sudan, where it's a little bit possible to operate. The banking system is still working, and which allows us also to do some further development and promoting some of the technologies that helps to increase agricultural production in Sudan.
Thank you very much, Michael. Yeah, I think it's important to highlight that the ICAR, but also the CGIAR more broadly, really considers itself being able to respond across different crises stages. So in terms of preparing, responding, and rebuilding, and I think you provide some very good examples of this. Thank you also for highlighting some of the operational challenges that conflict can bring for research work, and also, of course, some good examples of technology exchange on South-South cooperation there. Very insightful. Great. If I could move back to Sarah then, for the second round of questions. What are the main challenges facing the... So you mentioned, for example, the fact that these discussions are often still happening in silos across the MENA region. What are the main challenges facing the institutionalization of the climate, peace and security nexus in the region? I mean, why has it not as of yet been present in some of the key regional frameworks and regional bodies?
Thank you so much. Why has it not been present? I think going back to looking at the different regions and looking at the South and the efforts that have been done in the South on this agenda. We have, for example, Africa is currently in the process of launching its very first, and I think the very first regional policy on climate, peace and security, which is which is basically a process that is adopted by the African Union and the member states. And if we were to replicate this experience, for example, and looking at the Arab region or the MENA region, I think, not to go back to this again, but I think that the fact that we have a long way to go when it comes to bringing that conversation on the national level to the forefront is a key challenge. And I think the institutionalization of a regional framework on this topic would at least need the blessing and at least need the prioritization of several member states of this agenda to bring it to the forefront in the League of Arab States, in the conversations that are done region-wide on the topic of climate change. There is, for example, the Arab League has its climate change policy. It's a very good, a very well-developed policy on climate change. However, it does not include aspects of climate peace and security. Having said that, and not to be problem focused, the past two COPs, for example, were hosted in Arab states, whether it be Egypt or the Emirates, and both presidencies were very keen on leveraging this conversation to the forefront. COP27 had the launch of the Climate Responses for Sustaining Peace initiative. It was the first peace positive or peace focused climate initiative to be launched at a COP. And last year also, of course, as we all know, there was the declaration that was also done at COP28 under the Emirati presidency. So I think with several member states, with several countries, Arab regions, Arab countries or MENA countries adopting this conversation and taking it forward, we are on the right track to perhaps one day having an institutionalized a framework on climate peace and security. What would be needed is, of course, going back to the topic of knowledge and awareness, better knowledge, better awareness of this nexus, how it persists in the region, how fragility interacts with climate change in the region and its implications, and also the context specificity of the region's conflicts, and also climate change impacts is capturing that in a very context-specific way is extremely important for us to have a robust or a sustainable policy on climate peace and security or framework on climate peace and security. The region has its extremely diverse context, extremely diverse set of challenges, set of conflicts, and also climate change manifestations. So, like I said, we don't have it yet, perhaps because the member states have not come to an agreement on what climate peace and security actually is. What is the issue of climate displacement? We've seen the negotiations for the past couple of years, the Arab group of negotiators as well as the Arab member states negotiating independently. There has been a great gap when it comes to reaching a definition of who is, for example, a climate migrant. What is climate displacement? How do you identify that and put it on a piece of paper that seems agreeable to all the member states? This has been a challenge for us on the COP space, for the Arab member states, for the MENA member states, to come to an agreement on the terminologies and how do we capture the meaning of these phenomena. So taking that challenge into consideration, we can definitely look at institutions or organizations such as CGIAR, the Alliance, ICARDA, of course the UN members, the UN organizations, the active stakeholders in the region, to kind of bring in the knowledge and bring in the awareness that is needed to bridge that gap between what is understood to be climate action and what is understood to be peace building and conflict resolution. How do you bring that together? Moving forward, I think with the efforts that are being done right now, with the efforts of the COP27 presidency, COP28, and now that we have the Baku hub, which is also the member states of the MENA region are involved in, we are on the path of perhaps one day having this this policy framework in place. Also, I think the UNCCD COP, which is taking place in Riyadh, will have a focus on climate peace and security as well, or will have an angle of climate peace and security. So that's also an involvement in the region or a big advancement in the region on that agenda. Like I said, I think it's the issue of harnessing active political will on the member state level, and also bridging the science and knowledge gap, the science knowledge policy gap in the MENA region are the two key aspects that we need to focus on in order to reach a point where we are ready to launch a framework on climate peace and security similar to what is being done by the African Union on climate peace and security. Over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, no, and I think from first-hand experience, I mean, we've been working with other CG centres as well to organise some of these events in the MENA region and start chipping away a little bit at these kind of high-level institutions where we need to build this awareness, build these capacities. So, absolutely, I completely agree. If I could turn again to Philippa. You already alluded a little bit to this in your first response, but how can researchers and policymakers work in closer alignment to fill evidence gaps and translate knowledge into impact? And when looking specifically at the green growth strategy, what do you think were the key elements of success in the collaboration with the Alliance of Biodiversity and CGIAR on this topic? Thank you.
Thank you, Franz. So, of course, when it comes to collaboration between researchers and policy makers, I think speaking firsthand from the work we've done with the Alliance, CGIAR and Accord, they are our backbone. I would mention that firstly, for us to actually, include and establish climate peace and security in our policies. So the green growth strategy is actually, I think, one of our policies or documents that has highlighted clearly, the portion of climate peace and security, and this is in collaboration with research institutions. So the collaboration is really important, as it mentioned, it fills evidence gaps and also translates this research into impactful climate actions. Again, CIET and the Alliance have carried out a study and research in Southern Province, one of our provinces that has been greatly affected by the drought. And the report that they actually did develop has helped in informing the needs for the people in southern province. So when you look at the green growth strategy, it also highlights the success of inclusive stakeholder engagement and resource mobilization. And key elements in these partnerships include structured multi-stakeholder platforms that facilitate knowledge sharing and also align policy priorities with actionable research outcomes, which have paved the way for adaptive and evidence-informed policy. So the joint work done by the Alliance, Biodiversity International and CIET and Accord in supporting the government of Zambia in establishing a national agenda on climate peace and security has particularly, helped us to understand under which conditions climate-related risks to peace and security are, and how they will emerge across the country, as well as actions that can be taken by government and other national stakeholders to prevent and mitigate these risks from actually happening. So this integrated approach of harmonizing research, policy development, and operational coordination exemplifies a successful model of advancing green growth objectives within Zambia's climate action agenda. So for us, this collaboration has really, really been helpful. And I was really, really happy to come, and speak to it here, and all the great things we've done with the Alliance and CGIAR.
Thank you, Philippa. Yeah, no, thank you for highlighting the role that research can play across the entire evidence generation, planning and implementation cycle. Thank you very much. Okay, finally then turning to Michael again. So given ICARDA's extensive work in dryland regions affected by both climate change and conflict, as you already alluded to, could you share how ICARDA's research in heat-resistant crop varieties is helping address food security and resilience in these challenging settings specifically?
Yeah, so I mentioned already the example of Sudan with a heat platform, and but we take the material that comes out of this one, to the countries that are affected by heat, because so the plant breeders, they build resistance to heat into the advanced germplasm, and so it's a combination of a number of traits. Of course, in the drought and heat-prone environment, you are usually less affected by diseases and pests, but it's really the drought and heat tolerance that's important. And and then usually the release of varieties is a national it's under national authority, and that's why we have some difficulties of, for instance, if a heat resistant variety is released in one country, I mean to move it to another country. But there is work towards this one, and so for instance there's collaboration between Sudan and Egypt, for instance, in the policy side that allow that results that have been obtained in one country to be accepted in another country. So really to make the regionalization of germplasm more easier, and because very often that we see, in the last century we had a century of so-called mega varieties. A good variety that does good in one country, often you find like sister lines also doing well in other countries. So now the breeding approach is more country focused, or we call it specific, having specific product profiles, but still the same principle applies, that heat and drought tolerant stocks or varieties developed in one country can be used also as material in other countries, especially with the same agroecology or very similar agroecology. So that's why we are working towards really looking to regionalization. For instance, there is a big program in Africa called TAT. It is a transfer of African adapted technologies, and so TAT is for wheat, is operating in 10 different countries, African countries, such as Ethiopia, Nigeria, Mali, Tanzania, and it's really taking the best wheat varieties and try to promote it in those African countries, and so that's why often you see varieties that are doing good in one country can be also promoted in countries with the same agroecology. Very good progress has been made in Ethiopia, but also Nigeria, for instance, is really taking up, building up a wheat industry. Basically, from many years, they had like 50,000 hectares. Just 2 years ago, they jumped to 120,000 hectares. Now the next aim is to double, to go to 250,000 hectares. So this is all based on heat tolerant material that is grown under irrigation, and which is doing very well in many of the many African countries. So that's one work stream. So heat tolerance under irrigation, so the Nile countries, but then also in West Africa where you have water that you can irrigate. The other work stream is really the rain-fed areas. And so rain-fed areas in North Africa, such as Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria. Again, there is a very similar material that can be used in the neighboring countries, and that's why we try to promote regional approaches. For instance, we have a project funded by IDRC between Morocco and Tunisia, and really using similar or same germplasm sources in order to really help those countries very much affected by drought, and to make progress. The example of Morocco is, Moroccan agriculture is largely dependent on rain-fed agriculture. In this year, for instance, the last 3 years, the last 4 years, they have excessive droughts, and Morocco produced something like 3 million tons of wheat. In a normal year, with sufficient rainfall, they produce 10 million tons. So 3 times the amount, just depending on rainfall. So that's why it's important. The germplasm here is rain-fed, adapted to drought, and and the drought in northern Africa is different from the drought in the Middle East. What we see in Middle East and Eastern Mediterranean region is usually terminal drought by the end of the season, whereas in North Africa we see intermittent drought. So you have the first rainfall in October, and then often you have for 2 months, 3 months no rainfall, and so the first rain, farmers start to plant, the material germinates, but then it dies because there is no successive rain. And so these are all processes that we are trying to adopt in breeding material that can withstand this one. And so we're making some progress, and then also regionalization of germplasm and using same germplasm sources in these ecoregions like North Africa or Eastern Mediterranean. So that really helps to adapt to some of those problems.
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, I mentioned before that the CGIAR envisages itself to be able to respond, or prepare, respond, and rebuild after crises. And I think this highlights the role that also the deep-seated scientific expertise that centres like ICARA can bring to this discussion. So yeah, thank you for kind of highlighting. Perhaps someone should do a study on the correlation between seed exchange and interstate cooperation. That would be actually quite interesting. Okay, so we are moving slowly towards the end of the panel then. I just want to very, very briefly, then I'm going to be very strict and just say 30 seconds or less for just one key priority, basically, to kind of take this discussion forward. One key priority before we then invite the second panel on.
Thank you. I'm trying to spare everyone the journey to give me the mic. Yeah, key priority. Capacity building, I think, is the most important thing. I think this is a priority that we cannot directly address, but perhaps we could have better conversations about, maybe try to influence this conversation in a way with the member states, which is, I think, the depoliticization or desecuritization of the conversations around climate, as well as the politicization, to a certain extent, of the conversations around conflict resolution, peacekeeping, and peace building in the MENA region. We cannot completely depoliticize it, but perhaps we can desecuritize it in a way that allows for more people to be around the table, for actors on climate adaptation or climate action to have a place around the table and conversation about conflict resolution and peace building. We've had a very successful example about that, for example, when it comes to the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, which is what at once was a very removed conversation from the conversations on peace and security, or from the scope of peace and security. But the region has made great advancements in that regard. We have now an Arab network of peace mediators who is comprised of female or women diplomats from the member states. So perhaps we can replicate that experience if we try to move beyond the politicized or securitized conversations that make these conversations separate. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think for me, our priority would be, of course, first, capacity building as well, but also the importance of collaboration, and the outcomes and the great things that come out from that. So when we talk about capacity building, also we're really not just, talking about people knowing, but also people practicing, people living with what they learn in practice and including it in their, work plans or their development plans, especially at provincial and district levels. So for me, I think the priority is collaboration and also just enhancing capacity building, both at institutional and human. Thank you.
Yeah, and I would think that strengthening agricultural systems in the country, that really to achieve food security, it's one important component because it's not a guarantee. As I said, I mean, we are working in all those countries, and still 8 of the countries went to conflict and or post-conflict. So we cannot really, because there are other processes. I mean, political process, sometimes neighboring conflicts and so on. But we have a few green spots in our landscape. I mentioned Ethiopia as an example. So if they achieve food security, I mean, self-sufficiency in wheat production, for instance, that really helps to avoid some conflicts. And then, of course, capacity building, capacity sharing, and some of those networks to take farmers, from one country to another, to learn, to break down differences between neighbors, cultures. I think that helps in the peace building process, and you know. Neighboring countries along the big river deltas. So we have the problems along the Tigris and Euphrates. So you have Turkey, Iraq, Syria. It's really peace building efforts between the countries. And have capacity building, capacity sharing. We have the problems along the Nile. Last year the big dam in Ethiopia. Thankfully, it didn't escalate. It's really important that the neighboring countries need constantly to talk and to and guarantee minimum standards of water flows and so on. And now North Africa, Morocco, Algeria, it's another boiling conflict again. Capacity sharing, building, increasing food security in the countries helps a long way, and I think can reduce tensions between countries.
Great, thank you all so much for your contributions and your reflections. I'd like to invite a second panel, but can we first have a quick round of applause for our first panel today? Thank you very much. Okay, without further ado then, seeing as we are running out of time somewhat, I'd like to welcome on stage our second esteemed panel. So we have us, for the second round, we have Andrea Gongora with us, head of the Department of Vulnerability and Adaptation to Climate Change at the Guatemala Ministry of Environment and Natural Resources. And we also have Elizabeth Carabine, Climate Security Advisor to the Office of the Special Envoy of the Horn of Africa. So welcome both, and thank you so much for joining. Same request as the previous panel, if we could keep your answers to around 5 minutes, then we have some time for Q&A as well. So if I could start with you, Andrea, if that's okay. Given the interconnected nature of the climate mobility and conflict challenges in the dry corridor region, based on your experience in Guatemala, can you provide examples of cooperation or collaboration mechanisms in which Guatemala has engaged with neighboring countries on responding to this nexus?
Thank you. Good morning to you all. Thank you, friends. I just wanted to say something. My name is Andrea Fion. See, in Spanish, we have two last names, so just to make that. It's funny, but it's just to let you know. Thank you so much. So yes, Guatemala has been actively engaged with neighboring countries to address interconnected challenges with climate change and mobility conflict. One of that is the regional integration. As an example, we're part of the Central American Integration System, which is the CICA, and we're a member of that. And with this organization, we promote economical, social, and political integration among Central America. And within CICA, we collaborate with our neighbors on addressing these climate impacts. And there's different working tables within the CICA organization, and we constantly have different projects, regional projects, especially in the Central American region. We work very closely with the North Triangle, which is El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. And obviously this has a click with the mobility, because we know that we're the hallway for migration. So that also brings us together for that. We also work together on extreme weather events for droughts and extreme floods, because we know that those contribute to forced migration and conflict. We also work together with Mexico along the border. We have established some bilateral cooperation mechanisms to address migration in the border, security, and environmental issues. We also have included some efforts to combat human trafficking and smuggling along those borders, as well as initiatives to protect the shared systems and natural resources. As like I said before, we work closely with Honduras and El Salvador, because they're our neighboring countries for migration. And we're also looking into what are the roots of that migration, what is causing it. Like we've been talking before, the migration and climate change is linked, but is not necessarily documented how that link works. So that's something that we have to work on, and how it leads to poverty and more violence, and why is that linked to climate change. We also have different programs, focusing on economic development and environmental conservation among the Central American region. So within CICA, there are projects that are concerning all those economic and social issues, but around the environmental resources, such as the different forests or the watersheds that we also share. So it's a very integral approach that we do through that organization. And also we are part of different international cooperation treatments and agreements such as this, like COP20 and the framework for the climate change. We also work closely with the UNDP, and we have several projects with them, different agencies, and we've also been working closely with the United Nations for Migration Agency. We are currently updating our national climate change plan, and this includes a chapter for migration and mobilization, and we're working together with the UN Agency for Migration. Yeah, I think so. Wait. Okay. Also, in fact, we also just signed an agreement with the Global Center for Climate Mobilization here at COP29. It was signed by our Special Environment Issues Ambassador, and this is done through the External Relations Ministry, but still we work closely with them from the environmental side, because we need to figure out that link and use the data that they might provide us to address that to the plans, national plans and frameworks that need to be updated, and also strengthened with information and numbers. So we're working with them for that. So with this agreement, we hope to get more information and data that will help us link that into the frameworks, and then link that into budget. Because without budget, there's no actions we can actually take, but we cannot do those changes if we don't have the information on hand. So pretty much, I guess, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. Yes, no, thank you for, I think particularly in a region that has, as you said, shared resources, shared ecosystems, this collaboration is important. So thank you very much for illustrating some of the partnerships you're developing, both for evidence generation and the capturing accurate data, but also in terms of implementation operations. And apologies for the oversight on the name. We do have it on the slide. It was just entirely my fault for reading out incorrectly. If I could move then to Elizabeth, if that's all right. So based on your experience, what are the key challenges to harnessing active coordination in the Horn region between IGAD, member states, civil society, and others within the structure of the regional climate security mechanism?
Thanks very much, and good morning, everyone, and thanks for the invitation. So maybe I should first explain what's the regional mechanism that you referred to, and also clarify perhaps that this, who I'm representing, is the Office of the UN Special Envoy to the Horn, as there are quite a proliferation of special envoys in the Horn, given what I'm sure we understand here is a very conflict-affected, fragile, if you want to use this term, and climate-vulnerable region. So recognizing that, the Horn of Africa region, which we define as the member states to IGAD, the regional body, is also recognizing, the risk. There's an absolute consensus politically at the highest levels that climate poses risks to peace and security, including the displacement of people, food and water security, even governance, not just conflict, but also political risks, risks to, legitimacy, etc. And also recognizing, quite frankly, the lack of action at the international level, the UN Security Council specifically. These member states took a decision to establish a regional mechanism for improved analysis and shared understanding of what we're talking about. And Sarah really clearly articulated the kind of information that's needed for governments, for better coordination within and between countries, but also institutions. So an institutional structure, which is not existing well anywhere yet, and also for a common position that was not achievable at the international level. It still remains elusive, but the IGAD member states feeling they were ready to lay down a common position. So this is what we refer to the regional mechanism, and how it's structured, how it's been designed, is really to try to work across ministries that we would imagine have some responsibility or mandate on this issue. So that's environment, that's defence, foreign affairs and interior. And also then for that structure to be, vertical, so through the UN matching IGAD in the sort of technical and political levels, and then also domesticating that into the national level. So I think I probably don't have to elaborate what the challenges are in trying to do that. Coordination across ministries is very challenging. Since I'm really happy to hear these great examples of environment ministries, taking this issue on, because since our agonist colleagues are here, one challenge I really perceive is to engage the environment ministry. Of course, our entry point as a political mission is foreign affairs, and from a security standpoint it's not difficult to engage defence and interior in the region, but environment, it's hard to define. It's not a negotiation issue. There's enough to do to deliver on the Paris Agreement and commitments, and there's certain hooks, the NDCs, the NAPs you mentioned. We need to really find them and make the case, I think, at the national level and indeed at the continental or regional level, of how and why environment ministries need to help us and work with us on this agenda. So that's one. We do also have a kind of loose community of practice, and that's really important, including CGIAR in the region and other organisations. I don't think we have it right, since the question is on South-South cooperation, that we're integrating enough national institutions or even universities, research organisations. There's limitations to the degree that these are working on this issue, but I think what we tend to see and is an issue is the sort of analysis of the problem from think tanks based in Europe or from the UN indeed, which are quite not necessarily helping us to understand the context specificity or what to do. And I think I'll probably come back to it in my next part of the intervention, but this question of policy is one thing, the next step being action. If you're really on the front line of what political advice do you give to someone who's going to make a decision today on something, it's very hard to get that sort of level of granularity, because the analysis we have is global to global down, let's say, and I really, really miss the bottom up. So I'm sure that's our mistake, because it must be there. So that's where we still have a challenge to coordinate on the evidence we need to be able to coordinate and make decisions.
Thank you, Elizabeth. No, and I think this is a very good example of, as you said, I think political inaction at the global level being in some way avoided or at least surpassed by coordination at a regional level. And there is still this huge imbalance between the global north and global south, particularly on climate, peace and security in terms of evidence generation and the funding structures that go with it. So yeah, thank you for highlighting those. And also for our online listeners, you might be able to appreciate that on a day dedicated to peace, relief and recovery, we appear to have what is a very violent karate demonstration going on in the background. So apologies for any background noise. Okay, so if I can turn back to Andrea, if that's okay then. So Guatemala is a signatory to the Climate Relief, Recovery and Peace Declaration that was produced at the COP28 in Dubai of last year. And there are some efforts underway to also produce a similar declaration, I understand, this year. How is Guatemala working to actually operationalize some of the content of that declaration related to enhanced financial support for climate adaptation, improved practices and programming with relating to conflict sensitivity, and also strengthen coordination and collaboration amongst the key stakeholders that are present across the nexus?
Thank you. I just wanted to quick address to what you just said about environmental ministries engaging with this. I have to say that it's been hard. Like, we might have that willing an interest, and we see that there's a link and we see that there's a need. However, it's challenging even with our own authorities because it's not usually what they work with. So it's hard to make that to cut their attention on it, and also because it's such a sensitive issue. Sometimes they just feel like they don't want to step into it. So that's why we've been an experience. Something we've done through the year is work closely with the Ministry of External Affairs, and we set up a work table that we coordinate. So we're both coordinators of the table, and we invite to that several actors, like disaster management and other ministries and economy, and we try to have a discussion in that table that leads into information and data that can actually back us up for the authorities to actually step into it. It's been challenging. It's hard, and in the government sometimes we do have a lot of people rotating. So someone who was working on this is not next year, and that makes us go back again. However, for Guatemala, the fact that we do have that in a chapter for our climate change plan gives us an open door to work from it. Still, I have to say that every authority is different, and every 4 years we have to see if they want to engage in it or not. So I understand what you were saying, and I'm glad that you see our experience like something nice, but still I have to say it's not quite easy. It's been challenging. Anyway, so back to the question. Sorry for that. I just wanted to share. Yeah, as a signatory of the declaration that you mentioned last year, as a country we still have a lot of building up to do in order to actually be able to comply completely to what we agree on. So we are seeking to enhance more financial support for climate adaptation and climate action. So that's part of it. And we are looking for international funding and bilateral donors to implement that climate adaptation and resilience measures. On our framework for climate change, adaptation is our priority. However, on the practice, it's been harder to do that, especially because mitigation is easier to be measured and have indicators on it. So due to the lack of resources, in practice, it's been easier to track on mitigation rather than on adaptation. But it is established in our framework and on our plans that actually what we need is adaptation. So that's something that we've been working since last COP2, because it's part of the updating that we're doing in everything, on our NDC, on the plan, because we do need to focus more on adaptation, and we've seen it through the year too, because we've had so many economical issues and movement and everything because we are not really working on adaptation. Infrastructure has been suffering for that, and we don't even have goals for the adaptation sector in infrastructure, so we are working on that too. But like I said, our resources are limited, so that's why one of the things that we're doing is seeking for that increased funding in climate adaptation. However, we also need to have more capacity building on it to be able to access the mechanisms. The mechanisms are there. There's the Green Fund, there's the FDES, but we still need to be capable of making requests that actually go through and land in the country. Time is always an issue on both sides. On ours is bureaucracy, on theirs is that it takes time for those mechanisms to actually be implemented. Sometimes funding gets there when it's a little too late, especially for adaptation measurements. So that's another thing. We are exploring different existing financial mechanisms around the Green Climate Fund, the GEF, but also looking into different ones, so we can have options there. We do need to strengthen our financial frameworks too, because they are not updated and they need to be synchronized with what is happening now and how climate action is working. Climate finance is something very specific, and we do need to build capacity not only on the environmental ministry but also on the finance one, because all funding goes through them, and it has to be done correctly. Otherwise, those funds get lost, and sometimes they don't even they're not um, they're not familiar with the process, so mistakes are made during it. Um, Also, we need to build more institutional capacities, and we're investing on that. That's something that is happening through the year. The government is compromised to have more resources for human resources and have more people, and we still need to build capacities in them, but we're having more people. So just the fact that teams are growing, it's part of that commitment, because you do need people to effectively work on the plans, implement them, and we also need to have teams for the monitoring part. That is something that has been lacking, but it's part of the commitment to work on that. Also, the country has prioritized the evidence-based decision making, so we can invest in climate data collection, analysis, research. So that clicks with what I was telling before, that we're looking to have more data to really back up all the decisions. And this is important because, like I said before, we need to update the financial frameworks, but we need to make it smart. So in order to have that, and that turn that into budget, then we need to have the data. The way the country works is that we need to make the plans for every ministry, and then you go to Congress and ask for that budget, and then they provide the budget. But if we don't make a good report and a good why we need that budget for, usually what happens is that Congress assigns the previous budget. And it's been like that for over 15 years. So that budget is not really useful anymore, it's not enough. But it's also because the country hasn't really updated those reports. So that's part of something that we've been doing with this new administration and since the signing of this agreement. So we're working on that. Also, like you said before, the interministerial coordination, and that's something that, like I said, with the experience with the External Affairs Ministry is working so far. It is an issue, it is a challenge, I guess, sometimes with the other ministries, but we've been proven, for example, with that table, that it also works. We need that support, and during this COP, I think it's for the first time in maybe 5 COPs, I think, that we brought a delegation that has people from different ministries and different affairs, because we do need that collaboration, and we do need them to engage with climate change. Otherwise, they don't see it like it's not on their scope of work or something, so they don't feel any compromise to it. So that's something that we changed for this COP, I think. Like I said, that external affairs is very invested, and we have energy here too, which is sector is very important for us. Agriculture ministry is here too, so that is something that is helping to engage them. I think COPs are attractive, so it's a strategy to have them on board with climate change, and also collaboration with the social society and private sector. In Guatemala, we have a climate change council that is run by the president, and what we have now is private sector and organizations and indigenous organizations part of the council, so that also engage them too, to have them more being part of those efforts, and that they feel that everything is inclusive and participatory. The way the council works is that we have different working tables, and we have a secretariat, and everything is done by everybody before it gets to the president. So it's very participatory, and then the president strengthens the decisions that we have. So that's another collaboration that we've been doing. And like I said before, the regional cooperation, especially with organizations like SICA, that are part of that commitment. Yeah, pretty much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, some very good examples there. Just want to very briefly say, I think a good example of institutional spaces where coordination can actually occur, both horizontally between ministries and also vertically, as you were just saying, between different stakeholder groups. Okay, last but not least, for the final question then, back to Elizabeth. So as a climate security advisor, how can the UN political and peacebuilding missions better enhance their responsiveness to the climate security nexus in fragile, conflict-affected settings? What more can be done to achieve a more coherent approach across different missions in the Global South on this? Very easy question, so yeah.
Yeah, thanks very much. That's a very big question, so perhaps I'll focus on less the political or internal politics of doing that, and more on the these roles specifically, because the nature of the work of at least of my mission is in a region that has very fast real-time developments in terms of even of climate shocks, honestly, but also conflict or signs of conflict. So, you know, on a daily basis, real-time analysis of my colleagues on what do we see coming, considering we have a prevention agenda, you know, which we are, you know, limited in our success on, as you can see the evidence before you for the region. Being the climate security advisor in there to advise on the climate-related risks to peace and security is the number one function, and indeed in the mandates of these missions, is a challenge, obviously, because we don't have a lot of data or information or evidence yet, but it's also on the time frames. So going back to where I left off last time, we don't really need to continue to develop the kind of, at least from my perspective in my job, what the scenarios are, what the implications of those scenarios are for food and water and for even, you know, human security, the IPCC, we can follow this. And that kind of long-term thinking is important in a political mission. But on the day-to-day, if you see something arising in Somalia, I can pick it, you know, a conflict, for me to understand is that what is the environmental or climate-related dimension of this quickly, and then therefore what are the entry points, because I probably have 6 hours to provide it or it's gone. You know, what can those be, and then, you know, informing with a sufficient rationale and evidence to your leader that this is something they could feasibly take in an area that's new. What we found in the region, and I think I can say that for my mission at the regional level, working with the UN missions in South Sudan, in Somalia, and up until recently in Sudan, is that we have that kind of opportunity because it's been clear where political consensus is very difficult in the region and trust is low. This kind of technical entry point, which is so clearly a priority for all the countries, the climate change in general, climate action, is one on which we can convene where there's entry points to discuss the more difficult political issues for our leaders. So I think they've all got good examples of how that's been, but it does need to remain this careful balance of technical work and advice that is infusing into the politics and the mediation. And I think that when I would look around for or be asked, you know, what can we look at in the context of Sudan now, and that's a longer term issue. We're going to be trying to understand how we can solve that one for years, months, years to come. But what can we do now? Where would I go to find that kind of, except to Sudan, which I can't do, to understand what are the dimensions and entry points? And that can't be found in you know, research reports or in the kinds of tools that we see proliferating on this issue. You know, very many tools that are more or less the same, as I said, from the global data sets, which for some, if you're looking at mainstreaming this issue into a mission, is very useful. You can demonstrate, you know, there's this correlation or at least convergence of risks. But on the sort of granular level, or what I need to know today, and the translation of that into what I would say analysis rather than research, is a challenge. And I think that we have a certain number of these climate security advisors now in missions, and we should be moving towards having a very uniform and, you know, improved methodology for doing this, and that depends a lot on data. So that's an appeal to all of you who are working with data and research, and some of this is very sensitive data, can't be shared between member states, but can perhaps be shared with us as political missions to use, not publicly, not an internet tool, but a sort of joint analysis. So that's one thing. And again, just the last thing on this point, I mentioned it before, and what we've seen in the Horn is not just the conflict risk from climate change and its, the threat multiplier. We certainly see it. But also we don't have very much information, but we know we're seeing it, the political risks, civil unrest, and this is in the minds of the heads of state. There's a sort of existential threat to political situations from the kinds of shocks that they're seeing, as well as conflict risk. And we have very little evidence or analysis on this. It was referred to earlier by Michael's gone. What we think we can say about Syria and these movements, that kind of evidence and analysis and at least research question is one that I think we should move towards in the missions, as well as just here's a conflict, what were the root causes, and it's too late for us.
Thank you very much. I have many comments and questions, but maybe perhaps offline after the event. If we can maybe just very quickly have the Q&A slide on the screen at least, just so that people have a chance to look at the QR code. We don't really have time to do a specific Q&A now, unfortunately, as we have run out of time for the session. But I would invite you to talk to the panelists afterwards if you do have a specific question. So yeah, this is the end of the event. So thank you very much for joining in person and online, and wishing you